Hello and welcome to our panel on COVID-19 vaccines, the science, ethics, and policy. Today we're going to have a Q&A with 4 panelists. Our panelists are Dr. Mark Navin, Professor of Philosophy and Lecturer in Foundational Medical Studies at Oakland University. He's the author of Values and Vaccine Refusal, and he has a new book coming out, America's Vaccine Wars, California and the Policy of Mandates. Our second presenter is Dr. Trish Perl, Chief at the Division of Infectious Diseases and J.P. Sanford Professor in Infectious Diseases at UT Southwestern. Dr. Perl is a world-renowned expert in infectious diseases with past experience in the management of international healthcare outbreaks such as SARS and MERS. A third presenter is Dr. Sean Valles from Michigan State University. He's a philosopher of health whose work includes studies of the challenges of responsibly using race and ethnicity concepts in monitoring health disparities, scrutinizing the rhetoric of the COVID-19 pandemic, and examining how biomedicine meshes with public health. And he is the author of the 2018 book, Philosophy of Population Health, Philosophy for a New Public Era. Our fourth presenter, a panelist, is Dr. Seema Yasmin, a medical doctor and award-winning journalist. She's the director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative and clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University. And she's the author of Viral BS, Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them. My name is Matthew Brown, and I'm the director of the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology, and I will be moderating our panel. Our first question for today, which I'm going to ask Dr. Perl to answer, is about the vaccines, about the science behind the vaccines. So the vaccines that have been approved so far, as I understand it, are a new type of vaccine. So how do these vaccines work, and what is the science behind them?
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just give you a quick review on the types of vaccines that we are currently in the process of testing in some form or another, and then I'm going to focus on the 2 types and formulations of vaccines that are being considered or used in the United States. So as you can see, there are 5 different types of vaccines that are being constructed in some sort for COVID-19. DNA and RNA vaccines, live attenuated, inactivated, subunit, and viral vector. The DNA or RNA vaccines are one that we will talk about a little bit. This is a vaccine that uses either DNA or RNA molecules. It essentially produces a protein that the immune system will target, and these are viral proteins. It is not at all using any of our own DNA or RNA. It's using a viral protein. The advantage of these is they are really easy to design and very easy to manufacture. And these particular vaccines are the newer formulations, and what you have heard about these are the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. The second formulation that you will start hearing about more are the viral vector vaccines. The current vaccines that are being produced that are viral vector are the J&J and the AstraZeneca. This particular approach uses a harmless piece of the virus, and that again delivers the viral genes into the nucleus. The nucleus then produces the RNA protein. So again, it is not using any human RNA or DNA at all. What the advantage is these particular vaccines is they do elicit a very strong immune response and a prolonged immune response. And the current vaccine that has been constructed like this is the Ebola vaccine. And it's also a vaccine that's used a lot in veterinary medicine. So these vaccines, both of these structures are quite safe as far as we know. We don't have as much experience with the DNA and the RNA vaccines, but from a perspective of how they're formulated, they do not have the potential to produce some of the side effects that we've seen with other types of vaccines. What we do know is that 30 to 40% of people with the DNA and the RNA vaccine actually do have some side effects, but the side effects that we're hearing about, which are sore arms, fevers, chills, myalgias, tiredness, are really your immune response. And so it's actually a good thing that people are developing this, and it tells us that the vaccines are working. Overall, the mRNA vaccines are about 95% effective in clinical trials. There are further studies that are ongoing that look at the effectiveness, and what's important about those is that sometimes what we see in a clinical trial is a little bit different than what we see when we actually use it in the population. So that current piece is ongoing. The other important thing about these vaccines are they are equally effective in terms of in different ethnic groups and in different age groups. Overall, maybe a little less effective in the extreme elderly. The viral vector vaccines we have less information about. We won't really see any of the formal data until the 26th of February, when the J&J vaccine will be reviewed by the FDA. What we do know is from press releases where they've told us that the efficacy overall is 86%, 72% effective in the US population. So I think that's a quick run or overview of the current vaccines. The final vaccine you may hear about is the Novavax. That's a subunit vaccine, and the clinical trial is ongoing, and we are awaiting data from that. That actually may be a vaccine that has some utility in terms of boosting responses for some of these other vaccines. So I can stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Perl. My next question is for Dr. Yasmin. From the patient's perspective, how can one be sure that these vaccines are safe and effective?
So I love this question because I can say to you, well, there's a really easy, straightforward way of answering this question about safety and efficacy. And then there's the COVID era answer to this question, because we've done things differently and had to do things differently in the context of a global pandemic. So the straightforward answer is the way that we test vaccines for safety and efficacy is we have a process. We've been using it for decades. What we do is we start off with preliminary studies in the laboratory. You're testing your experimental vaccines in petri dishes, in animal models, maybe in monkeys, for example. Then you move on to your clinical studies, your clinical vaccine trial, where, and I think people are familiar with this language now, you have phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trials. In a nutshell, in your phase 1 trials, you're working with a relatively small number of healthy participants. You're testing really to look for what dosage might work and really just are there any adverse events in that first small phase. You move up to phase 2 trials, you have many more people involved compared to the phase 1. You're still checking for really safety and dosage. And then your phase 3 trial is the ones where we start to get a little bit more excited about if we hear good news, because this is where you've recruited tens of thousands of people. You will have a gold standard is a randomized controlled trial where within those tens of thousands of people, there are some who are receiving the vaccine and there are others who are receiving a placebo, and nobody, not the participants, not the doctors and nurses involved, should know who is getting what. We learn that later. And it's really the phase 3 trial for the vaccine that's our efficacy trial. So when we hear those numbers that we just heard, whether it's about 95% efficacy, for example, those numbers are coming out of the phase 3 trial. Now, the reason I started this answer by saying things are a little bit different now is because I think it's very important to be transparent about the scientific process. I believe the vaccines that have received emergency use authorization are safe and efficacious, but we have to explain to people how it was that we managed to do in 10 months what on average takes 10 years, and in reality can take decades if it ever happens. I mean, we just have some diseases for which we have never successfully developed a vaccine. What we did last year, which was unprecedented, I believe, was do some stages of the clinical trial testing of vaccines in parallel instead of in series. So some of the animal models, for example, were happening at the same time as the early clinical trials. And I think that was appropriate and it was okay, but I'm very passionate about being transparent about the scientific process and giving people that context so that when they say, well, you told me it normally takes 10 years to develop a vaccine, so why would I think it's okay to take a vaccine developed in 10 months? The context is what helps you understand that. Also, thinking about context, we cannot just talk about science without talking about politics and without talking about that context. Because here in the US, we rely on the US Food and Drug Administration to approve or issue emergency use authorizations of medicines and vaccines. And what we saw happen last year, in my opinion, was very troubling in that, in my opinion, the FDA succumbed to political pressure and I think rushed emergency use authorization sometimes, not for vaccines. One example is March 28th, FDA issued emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine. Many of us complained about that. We felt that the communication around it, the calculations even, were misleading, just really basic errors. And then we saw in June 15th, that the emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine was revoked. The reason I bring that up now is because that incident and those kinds of incidents can really hurt the credibility and public trust in the scientific process. We also have this issue that vaccines are assessed slightly differently in different countries. So in the UK, where I'm from, I actually don't think the emergency use authorization process is as rigorous, in fact, as what the FDA does. In the UK, my interpretation from my interviews with people there is that the data given over by vaccine manufacturers is kind of just taken as is. It's trusted by the independent review boards that look at the vaccine results. In the US, that raw data actually is requested from vaccine makers, and then it's reanalyzed by some of these independent scientists. So I have to explain all of that in terms of saying these are processes that we have for checking safety and efficacy. We have to really be careful about explaining them and explaining the political and cultural and geographical context to really do the work that I do, which is building trust in science and hopefully building trust in vaccines as well.
We have a question from the audience. They'd like a little more clarification about the difference between the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines and the new Johnson & Johnson and perhaps Novavax vaccine. So Dr. Yasmin and then Dr. Perl, could you speak to that?
Sure, I'll weigh in briefly. So with the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines, they both use a very similar and new platform, the messenger RNA. They work in essentially very similar ways. One of the key differences is that the Moderna vaccine requires a higher dosage than the Pfizer vaccine, but this same idea that you are bypassing the need to actually work with the virus in any way to develop the vaccine. You think about the older school vaccines we have, you're often receiving through that shot some small part of a vaccine, perhaps a weakened version of the vaccine, and that's being used to stimulate your immune response. The messenger RNA platforms are doing away with that, and that's one reason why they were able to be developed so quickly as well. You're just being given some small snippet of the genetic code to make one part of the virus, the spike protein. When your body reads that code, it actually then does away with the mRNA once it's read the code, but it uses that code to make the spike protein yourself so that your immune system knows how to respond should you encounter the virus in real life. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is different. It falls under the viral vector category that Dr. Perl just talked about. You're using a virus that can't hurt us or make us sick, and into that you're adding the DNA for the spike protein so that the body's exposed that way. The body still sees that DNA code, uses it to make the spike protein. I think what's most exciting about the J&J vaccine is that it's a one-shot vaccine. For me as a public health doctor, that's a game changer, because you lose so many people when you're trying to get them in a second time into your clinic to vaccinate them when it's a 2-dose regime. It can also be kept at regular fridge temperatures for 3 months, which is a game changer too. Compare that to the Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna vaccines, which you have to keep essentially around the same temperature as winter in Antarctica. And that can be a really big logistical challenge for many, many places. The Novavax vaccine that we've been hearing more and more about is really interesting. It falls under that subunit category. And here what you're doing is you're taking the spike gene for the coronavirus, you're putting that into another virus, a baculovirus, injecting that combination into moth cells. Now, what the moths do is they see that DNA, they use it to make lots and lots of spike protein. Then what the scientists do is take those bundles of spike proteins, assemble them into nanoparticles, and then give us that as the vaccine. So your body's exposed to the spike protein that way. Your immune system reads that, learns it, and mounts an antibody and T-cell response and gets ready should you encounter the virus in real life. The Novavax vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine. It can also, I believe, be kept at fridge temperatures, but again, unlike J&J, it is a 2-dose vaccine. So I'll leave it there.
Dr. Perl, would you like to add anything?
I really think she covered almost everything that needs to be said. I think the most important thing about all of this that's really, I mean, it's complicated, but each one of these is stimulating both what we call your innate and adaptive immune systems in the same way. You're introducing a protein in some way. We package that protein a little bit differently, but we're stimulating your immune response. And so it's very similar to what would happen when you have the native infection. You're stimulating an immune response, but we're just doing that artificially using a vaccination. And the nice thing about the vaccination is the immune response we tend to stimulate is much more stable than the immune responses that we see with natural infections for this virus, not for all infections, but for this particular infection. So that's what's important in that. And the other thing to just add on also is with both the J&J and the subunit vaccines, we have used those with other types of vaccines that you all are familiar with. So that technology has been used, and many of the people on these who are listening have probably received a vaccine, at least with the subunit, in the past. But all of these are just stimulating your immune system, and then a second dose is boosting it a little bit more to make sure that we keep your immune system activated in a way that if it sees the virus at all, it's going to try and say, no, we don't want you in here, and we're going to start attacking you, and that's exactly what we want to happen. Okay,
thank you. So there's a lot of interest from the audience about the prioritization of the vaccines. And so let's turn now to perhaps some ethical and policy questions about that prioritization. So who's getting early priority and who isn't? How are those decisions made? Are the priorities for distribution fair and equitable? Obviously, we're a university community. There's some interest in where teachers fall in that prioritization scheme. So Dr. Navin, could you start us off on that question?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Brown. So I think it's good to begin with the fact that all of the COVID vaccines in the United States have been purchased by the federal government, which means they're our vaccines. And so we're faced with a set of ethical, political, and logistical questions about who gets to go first. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, that's a part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, identified 4 ethical principles to make sure that we were doing the right thing in deciding who gets to the front of the line for vaccines. The first, to maximize benefits and minimize harms. right? Is the goal there to reduce infections, which is to say to reduce morbidity and mortality from the disease, but also to preserve the community's ability to respond to COVID and to take advantage of the multiplier effect. For example, by keeping an ICU nurse healthy, you might be able to save multiple people's lives. The second principle is to promote justice, to make sure that all of us have a truly fair and equal opportunity to be vaccinated and that arbitrary inequalities are not introduced to the allocation scheme. The third is to mitigate inequalities. We know that there are massive healthcare inequalities in this country, and the defenders or the authors of the federal allocation guidance wanted to make sure that COVID vaccine allocation was not going to promote or create healthcare inequalities. And then finally, to have transparency, to make sure that whatever guidelines were developed were clear, were accessible, and were open to criticism, which I think we'll get into in a second. Notably, though, that ethical guidance was combined with the best scientific evidence we had about the disease to come up with the phases for allocation that you may have heard of. In phase 1A, which most communities are finishing up or have already concluded, allocation was prioritized for residents of long-term care facilities because of their high vulnerability to death and to serious disease, but also for healthcare personnel because not only of their vulnerability, but the ability to have a multiplier effect by keeping them working, protecting the community. Most of us have entered well into phase 1B that prioritizes vaccine for people 75 years and older, and also the prioritized essential workers, which include police and firefighters and teachers. And then it moves on through 1C and 2, and you're familiar with that. What you probably also know is that the individual states have received this guidance, but interpreted it in their own ways. So in my state of Michigan, they've decided when entering phase 1B that they would not just vaccinate people 75 and older, but would vaccinate 65 and older. Other states have gone other directions, and in particular, Dr. Brown, this question about who counts as a teacher. Teachers are prioritized in phase 1B. Some states have said that university faculty count as teachers, and some, including Michigan, have decided not. And then relatedly on questions of implementation, states have taken a variety of different steps in deciding which means to use to get the vaccines out. So some have given a vaccine priority to healthcare systems to distribute to their patients and to their employees. Others are relying more on local health departments to stand up vaccine clinics, and others are putting a lot more emphasis on private pharmacies, and most are using a mix of all of those. But some states, for example, are going more the other way than one way than the other. So you might have heard that West Virginia has not relied much on the private pharmacies for vaccinating its long-term care residents, and actually have much greater success in quickly vaccinating them. And so while this begins with a set of sort of ethical principles, by the time it gets down to the state and local level, there are all kinds of political and logistical contingencies that enter into it, and I think quite rightly raise some important questions about fairness and equity, and I'm interested to hear what Dr. Valles has to say about that.
Great, thanks, Mark. Dr. Valles.
Yeah, I'd like to, excuse me, I'd like to second everything that that Dr. Navin said. Those are essentially the issues that we're facing in terms of when we prioritize an emergency room nurse as opposed to a person who's working in food service as opposed to someone who is over 65. We're essentially trying to accomplish different goals with each of those strategies. So on one hand, we might be trying to protect people who are at the highest risk of having complications and severe illness or death. In some sense, that's what we're trying to do for everybody, but we're achieving that in different ways. If we're trying to, for example, treat somebody who are thinking of as both a potential risk to others because they are living in a high density environment, like they're living in a long-term care facility, or if they're a nurse who is someone who could hypothetically treat many patients. And so while we're both focused on trying to prevent severe illness and death, we're also accomplishing very different things by again prioritizing someone who's a food service worker as opposed to a teacher, as opposed to someone who's just of a certain age or who has pre-existing conditions. And so it's a shame that we sort of started relatively late in this process of actually having any kind of public discourse about it, that we didn't really have these conversations about, is it more important to have students receive K through 12 education, or is it more important for people to have access to certain kinds of recreational facilities? Well, what exactly is our sort of set of priorities here? And so I think there was sort of a lack of that kind of real discourse. And so what has forced us into now is a short-term phase where we're basically arguing about the implementation, when I think that's actually in some sense distracting us from a bigger issue. So the epidemiologist Jeffrey Rose in the 1980s laid out a distinction between two fundamentally different strategies of doing public health work, and this is both sort of a matter of strategy and also an ethical matter as well. And so on the one hand, you can take your small amount of resources and you can focus that on the people who you've identified as being at the highest risk of actually some sort of harm. And so we have a certain amount of money to spend on anti-drug campaigns, for instance. And so we can find whatever population is going to have the highest rate of the highest need for that kind of funding, or it would work for any other kind of resource. On the other hand, we can take all of that funding, all those kinds of resources, whatever those might be, and we can try to distribute them across the entire population. So we could basically try to change the state of the entire community, so that we can try to make a healthier place for everyone to live, and giving a small benefit to everybody. So even something like seatbelt laws are an example of this, where one thing that's applied to the entire community, where everybody is now required to wear a seatbelt, that's going to benefit some people more than others, but in the end, it's going to make a healthier community for everyone. When you're trying to do a vaccine, which we're working towards the goal of having the vast majority of people around the world vaccinated, we're trying to create a world where there's basically no purchase for COVID-19 to begin spreading inside communities. We're trying to create what's called herd immunity or community immunity, so that there's basically enough of the world is immune to COVID-19 so that it can't start spreading again. And so our long-term goal is to really change the shape of our entire world, so that we have a world where COVID-19 can't continue spreading. But we're stuck in the short-term phase of, well, right now we only have a few vaccines to hand out. And so we need to decide by what standard should we try to use this high-risk strategy of, okay, should we try to prevent the health system from being overwhelmed? So should we focus on doctors and nurses? Should we focus on trying to mitigate the harms of children not having access to education, which is something that's not equally distributed? And so if you have high-speed internet access and good computers at home, that's a wealth issue and a class issue, as well as just a general sort of education issue. And so we're sort of, because of the sort of scarce nature of these vaccines, we're sort of trying to move between this high risk strategy into this population strategy. And I think we sort of need to be prepared for this to be a bumpy road, because these are fundamentally different kinds of ways of doing public health work. And so the long-term goal is to change the world and to change the shape of the world, so that we have a place where COVID-19 can't spread, just like we successfully changed the world so that smallpox cannot spread in the world. We successfully changed the world so that measles, if in the vast majority of places, is unable to spread. But in the meantime, we need to figure out, okay, so we have these few things, now we need to figure out which ones should we sort of prioritize. And so it's so very important to have those discussions, but I think it's important to also not lose sight of the long-term goal, which is to change the shape of the entire global community. And so we need to make sure we're working towards that, and not just worrying about who gets to be first in line or second in line.
Dr. Valles, do race and class affect the need for and the ability to get access to the vaccine?
It certainly impacts need in the first place. So I think the background problem is, or part of the background problem is that basically exposure to COVID-19 is not randomly distributed across populations. That's not something is not sort of like you draw a number out of the hat and a certain percentage of the population is exposed. It's not like that at all. And so, for instance, I am not an essential worker. I work from home virtually every day. I'm inside my bedroom right now. Other people have to go to the work and be surrounded by tens or even hundreds of people every single day. So for instance, if you're stocking a grocery store. And so the way we've distributed those jobs inside US society is also not blind to race and to class. And so we've had this interesting shift where all of a sudden the jobs that we'd basically given the least social prestige to and the least respect for, like the importance of stocking groceries because people got to eat, like picking vegetables so that people can again survive. And so what's happened is we've shifted so that we we no longer ignore people doing those jobs. We're saying, okay, you're now an essential worker, and we need to say that you are required to come to work. You can't just stay home, and we're not going to provide any resources that you're able to afford to be able to stay home because you have a vital service to society. But what we haven't done is done things like provide living wages to everybody, and so we're stuck in this sort of like this tension between saying that a grocery stocker is both essential and also not worth investing in. And so I think we need to put higher priority on actually providing resources to people who we've decided are being required by our society to put themselves at risk. And we also need to recognize that the people who we've decided are these essential workers. So for instance, people in the service industries are disproportionately people of color. They're disproportionately people of low social class and low income. And so we need to, there are exceptions, for instance, physicians are also essential workers, but again, with sort of service industries and doing retail jobs, things like that, these are things that our society and our history through hundreds of years of American history, these are not randomly distributed. And so we need to recognize the fact that the world we built and the world that COVID-19 entered into was not one in which people's access to basic services and needs was going to be fair to everyone. And so we're dealing with the repercussions of having an unjust world that we've built.
Thank you, Dr. Valles. I have a question from the audience that's, I think, relevant here. We're talking about prioritization. What about children, right? Is it true that kids under the age of 15 are not able to get the vaccine? And if that's so, why are children not on the priority list?
I could just pipe in and say that the clinical trials were only done in, depending on which clinical trial you look at, in adolescents, adults 16 or 18 and over. So there was no information in children prior to that. Currently, there are clinical trials ongoing in children, and it's anticipated that we will have information about the effectiveness or the efficacy of these vaccines, as well as dosing regimens, as well as safety by early summer. And so I think from a scientific point of view, we generally start off looking at most of these new compounds in adults before we look at them in children, and then we move to children. So that's from the scientific point of view. In terms of prioritization, I'll let my colleagues talk about that.
Dr. Valles?
Yeah, so I think at the moment the primary concern with the way we've been prioritizing developing these vaccines in the first place is to prevent severe illness and hospitalization and death. That's been the main motivating factor when we were designing the clinical trials. It was built around trying to prevent those. Those were the outcomes that were being focused on. There are other ways of developing vaccines or treatments so that you could try to focus on trying to prevent spread. And so the ability of a vaccine to prevent transmission from one person to another is not the same thing as their ability to prevent illness in the person who receives illness or death in the person who receives the vaccine. Based on the evidence we've seen so far, children are not taking the brunt of the illness or death from COVID-19. There are terrible exceptions, and children are not immune to COVID-19. Or at least not as a whole, and so they still do suffer and occasionally even die from COVID-19, just at vastly lower rates. And so when we start looking at the goals and the benefits of trying to vaccinate children, I think it's going to be primarily built around the idea of trying to prevent children from serving as exposure routes to other people. And so the risk of having a large number of unvaccinated children isn't so much that the children themselves will suffer, although some will. The larger impact will be in them exposing other people to COVID-19, and so that's my bigger concern, is trying to address the problem of children being potential vectors for COVID-19, also suffering as well. But I don't want children to be going to school, exposing each other, and then bringing it home and infecting their grandparents, for instance. Because even if people are vaccinated, they can the vaccines are not 100% effective in every single person, and so we need to take seriously that risk to the entire community, not just to them individually.
Okay, great, thank you. Some members of the audience have expressed some concerns, for example, about potential. They've heard things about side effects of the mRNA vaccines. Dr. Yasmin, could you talk a little bit about why people are hesitant about getting the vaccine, and how you would respond to that?
So this is what I study, and I always tell people that you could talk to 10 people who are vaccine hesitant and hear 10 quite different reasons as to why they might be vaccine hesitant. And so it's really important that we don't oversimplify that we don't treat communities as monolithic, because there are cultural, historical, religious, geographical reasons and context as to why we hold particular beliefs about vaccines. And I will say that I've been studying the spread of false information during epidemics for a number of years, since like 2015. It's been difficult to sometimes get large domestic or international public health agencies on board that vaccine hesitancy, even anti-vaccine movements, are a threat to public health. And I know that sounds strange now, because we've all been dealing with not just a pandemic, but what we call a misinfodemic, an epidemic of misinformation, but it's been an uphill struggle for a number of years. So I'm really glad, at least, that now in the context of the pandemic, you're asking me this question. We are having this discussion around vaccine hesitancy, because for me, it's like a long time coming. It's an overdue conversation on the public field. But at the same time, what I see sometimes happening with this conversation is it just losing the nuance and being simplified. So for example, we keep hearing in some cases that Black people and people of color are hesitant towards receiving vaccines, or might even be anti-vaccine. And so it's really important that we remember communities are not monolithic, that within a population, even within one neighborhood, one community, there can be quite heterogeneous beliefs about vaccines. The other way to answer this question that you're asking me about, specifically vaccine hesitancy, is to understand that it's not just about the vaccine itself. So for example, for a number of years, I've been tracking anti-vaccine movements, looking at what kind of messaging and campaigning do these groups use. Often it can be quite specific, and it can be very biological, if you like. It could be messages saying vaccines are toxic, vaccines cause autism, none of which are true. Now, increasingly, I'm seeing campaigns and messaging that say vaccines are in opposition to the American way of life. If you get vaccinated, you are anti-freedom, you are anti-American. So then you start seeing, okay, this is about a lot more than what's in a vial. It's about a lot more than what gets injected into somebody's arm. It's about these really deep-seated cultural, political, religious beliefs. And so as science communicators, as public health physicians, and as scientists in general, we have to be careful about contextualizing the science and making sure that we are speaking to the particular fears and anxieties and concerns of different communities and different people. Coming back to that point that 6 different people might give you 6 very different reasons as to why they're on the fence, or maybe even vehemently anti-vaccine, which is much more extreme. We can't then, in my opinion, have a one-size-fits-all public health messaging approach, because you're going to lose the specific reasons people have for holding those beliefs. And I will say, just to wrap this up, the anti-science and anti-vaccine brigades and movements are very good at telling their story. And one of the reasons they are good at this is because they do a lot of research, and they really listen to what people's specific fears, concerns, and anxieties are, and then they very carefully craft messages that speak to those particular fears. And so I'm not saying we should exploit people's fears, but as communicators, we need to listen, have empathy, and understand the specific reasons as to why somebody might say either outright, I don't want COVID vaccines, or might say, you know what, I get my flu shot every year, but I'm kind of on the fence about this one. Can you help me understand more?
Okay, great, thank you. So we've heard that it's important for people to get vaccinated, right? Dr. Navin, do people have an ethical obligation to get the vaccine? And as some of the audience have asked, is it going to be mandatory to get the vaccine? Is it ethical? to make it mandatory to force people to get vaccinated for the sake of public health? Do you have thoughts about that?
I have lots of thoughts. Thanks, Dr. Brown. And I'm hoping that my colleagues will join in, because I think this is one of the richer topics that really is still on the table. So I don't like to use the word obligation, because obligation is something that you absolutely must do. I think all of us have moral reasons to accept the vaccine. So many of us think we have reasons to have to care for ourselves, either directly or because I need to take care of myself so I can take care of my children, my family. We also have reasons to get vaccinated to protect ourselves from harming vulnerable people. Lots of people cannot protect themselves, especially if you can get a vaccine. What you're being offered is an opportunity to keep yourself from hurting someone else. That's a really good reason to get the vaccine. And then also, I think there are reasons of fairness, of solidarity to get the vaccine, because what we're doing when we get this vaccine is not just changing your risks of infecting someone else. We're building a society, as Dr. Valles has said, a society in which it's much less likely that we're going to even have outbreaks of this disease. And we often think there are duties to do your fair share to contribute to these valuable public projects. Now, whether you have an obligation to get vaccinated depends on how weighty those reasons are for you. And that's going to differ depending on who we are. So if you're a nurse in an intensive care unit, you're much more likely to be facing many vulnerable people who you could infect and harm. And I think for that person, there's a very weighty reason of harm prevention to get the vaccine. Similarly, I think, and maybe this is a more controversial claim, but I'm quite committed to it. If you're a very privileged person who has benefited very much from the social institutions of our society, then I think the duty of fairness, right, to sort of make contributions towards the institutions we're building maybe weighs more heavily on you than if you're someone who has not been as advantaged and privileged by your role in our society. And so relatedly, I think, and this gets back to this vaccine hesitancy point that Dr. Yasmin was making so nicely, we need to be careful not to characterize people who are hesitant about COVID vaccine as if they were irrational or immoral people. And in particular, they're not like the most hardcore overall vaccine refusers, right? Only 1% to 2% of the country refuses all vaccines. Recent polls show between 20 and 30% or more of people expressing an intention not to get the COVID vaccine. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. And the one that's come up that people have talked about is this is a new vaccine that uses new technologies that really relies on people having a lot of trust to get this vaccine. Now, I'm someone who has a lot of trust in these institutions, but there are lots of good reasons for other people, especially based on race and class, to have lower levels of trust. And this is not a vaccine like measles that we see children every year getting and having received in a very safe and healthy way millions of times. For most human beings, most of the time, we do things because other people around us are doing them. And I think it's a bias among academics and among professionals of various kinds that we think we trust the evidence and make good judgment and other people should do that. That's unreasonable to expect that of most people. So I think we really need to be taking our time and modeling good behavior and cultivating social norms around vaccination, rather than thinking, one, about obligations, and then, happy to say some more, but also about mandates. And maybe other people want to chime in on the broader ethics issue, but I have lots of things I'd love to say about whether the government or private businesses should be be forcing us to get vaccines. But maybe it's worth slowing down to talk about the ethics questions first.
Dr. Perl, you want to weigh in?
I'm not going to talk about the ethics as much, but what I am going to talk about is the lack of data and us presenting information in a way that is tangible to other people, and also that is somewhat culturally sensitive. And I think that a lot of times when I talk to people, it's not that they're opposed to the vaccine, it's that they have questions and they don't know. And in our rush to get vaccine out and to this person and that person and whatever, we've forgotten one of those really key steps about really giving people the information that they need and answering all of their key questions. So this goes to some of the points that others have been making about the reasons behind it, but some of that is really just making sure that we take the time to provide people with the information that they need. And we are seeing that people's opinions about these vaccines are changing. So there may be people who will never get the vaccine, but I think that there are a lot of people who aren't saying no, never. They're just saying, I need more information. Can you help me?
Dr. Valles?
Yeah, that resonates with me as well, Dr. Perl. That these questions about wanting to wait and see how things play out and have questions. One thing I've been recommending to people who I interact with who have concerns. I'm not sure if hesitancy is the right word. It's people aren't necessarily saying I will or will not get a vaccine at whatever date. They're expressing concerns and questions. One thing I try to express is that while we by definition don't have certain kinds of long-term data about these vaccines, that we don't have a 10-year study of the Moderna vaccine because it has not existed for 10 years, for instance. But what we do know is quite a bit about the long-term effects of COVID-19 infection, and it can be rather scary. And so even if we don't know exactly some of the long-term effects of the vaccines, we've seen a lot about the sort of the short to medium term effects. If we're sort of going to make a sort of calculated gamble, because in some sense we don't know everything, we have to make the best decision. Do I get vaccinated or do I not? The prospect of having what's called long COVID or long-term effects of COVID-19, where you can have memory loss issues and exhaustion and sleep disturbances and all sorts of other really nasty long-term effects that we don't really quite understand how they emerge in the first place. So we have to. So when I express that to people, sometimes it makes more of an impact. Thinking like, well, we don't know everything about the vaccines, but we also don't know everything about COVID-19 infection. But we do know enough to know that long-term effects can be quite scary. And regarding the people's concerns and this problem of trust and trying to build trust, I think it's important to recognize that the trust is something that has to be earned. It doesn't just sort of appear out of nowhere. And so when I think about how well I'm Latino, I'm Mexican American, and so how well have Mexican Americans been served by the biomedical industry inside the United States? It's been a mixed bag. And so if someone asked me 2 years ago or even this year, do you trust, say, the name of a biotech company? If you're going to ask me that as sort of a straight out question, I would say, well, not especially. But that's a different question from, do you trust that this particular vaccine that's been vetted by this many layers of different experts and overseen by a large number of other bodies of experts? Do I trust that this vaccine is as effective as advertised? That's a different question than, do I trust biomedicine, or do I trust the establishment, or do I trust this particular company? And so I've been urging people to sort of tease apart their distrust for individual companies or for the biotech industry or the pharmaceutical industry or whatever. I think there are lots of reasons to have concerns about them, but that's different from the question of, does this particular vaccine work as it's being described? And so that raises the question of, okay, so what is the process that we've used for actually evaluating these? And so that's so I think it's important to sort of separate these out.
Okay, thank you. We've had a number of audience members ask questions about the variants of the vaccine, the different strains that have come out. And as I understand it, in the news we tend to refer to these variants by the places they were first detected, but they're kind of all over and they're in the U.S. Could you talk about how they're affecting the pandemic and what we know about the vaccines in relation to these variants, Dr. Perl?
Sure, I would be happy to talk about this, and of course ask my colleagues to add anything that I haven't stated. So the first thing to say is that coronavirus is what we call an RNA virus. And what we know about RNA viruses is that they love to change. Influenza is an RNA virus also, and we have to have a new influenza vaccine every year because it shifts and sometimes it actually drifts. So these one of the characteristics, if you will, of RNA vaccine or RNA viruses is that they do change, and it's not an unexpected finding at all. And we've been watching this since the inception of the pandemic. We have been seeing minor variations and mutations and changes over time. And we can tell you that early on there were what we call clades, certain clades of virus in certain areas, and that we could track where those spread. So this is not unexpected. What has recently changed is that sometimes you can get either one mutation or several mutations together that change the properties of the virus and how it behaves in the host, meaning how is it behaving in us. And what has been unique about 3, maybe 4 of these new, what we're calling variants, is that their behavior in the population has changed. So the UK strain, which emerged in about September, has several mutations or that appear to make it more virulent, much more transmissible, and potentially more virulent. And you know, the virulence and whether there's increased morbidity data is a little bit controversial right now, but is currently being studied. There are some groups that think it is, some groups are saying it's not. But it is more transmissible, and we can track that not only by looking at the genetic code, but also how it behaves in the population. Similarly, in South Africa and in Brazil, which are the most recent, there have also been again, some variants that have emerged, and what's different about these is that they do something that we call immune escape, but they may not respond to certain immune modulators as effectively. So, for example, they do not appear to respond to some of the monoclonal antibodies that we've been using in treatment, as well as the current strains. And similarly, they may not respond to some of the vaccines as effectively as the strains that these vaccines were developed for, which emerged last January. So the reality is that people are looking at this, and currently it does appear that the South African and the Brazilian strains are not quite as effective against not only some of the monoclonal antibodies, but potentially some of the vaccines. And what does that mean? Well, it means, because we see this, you know, with flu and other vaccines, is that one, we either re-engineer the vaccine. And the good news is with these mRNA vaccines, remember I told you, you can redesign them really quickly. And if you look at what they did, they designed those mRNA vaccines within 3 or 4 days of having the virus sequences. So this is possible, and this is what's so exciting about these vaccines. And so we may need a booster. The second thing is that we just may need a booster. We may need to have a higher antibody response. So currently, some of the vaccines, J&J is talking right now about doing giving 2 doses of vaccine. So we may just need a booster. So I think because these strains are, we aren't surprised. We are monitoring them. We've got to monitor them. We've got to use all the tools that we have to monitor them, including looking at the genomes of the viruses. But we also have to recognize that it's not totally unexpected. And that is why we're telling everyone, yeah, you're vaccinated, but you still have to wear a mask. You still have to social distance. And, you know, this is going to be a little bit of a recurrent theme and process that we will be going through with these variants. So we're monitoring them. I will say the one thing that is going to be a big challenge in the US with all of this is that We simply do not have the infrastructure that you see in the UK or in Europe, where they have a process to test a lot of these strains rapidly. And so we do not have as much of a picture, if you will, of how widespread these strains are in the US, just because we don't have that infrastructure in place. And I think that does put us at a bit of a disadvantage, and we are currently trying to build that, but it's going to take some time.
A member of the audience asked us to come back to the question of mandatory vaccines. Dr. Navin, could you speak quickly to the question of mandates?
Sure, I'm glad to. So the short story is, I think it is a premature question to be taking too seriously, and that's for three related reasons. So first, you should only be talking about mandating vaccines if there's enough supply to give to everybody, but there's not. And so our problem now is to get vaccine to people who want it. And it can be in that way counterproductive to talk about mandating it. Two, you should only be mandating vaccines if you have epidemiological need for it. But it could be the case, and we're going to hope it's the case, that enough people will voluntarily get the vaccine that we get our current pandemic under control and deaths and morbidity associated with this disease down below seasonal influenza rates. And so even though we have seasonal flu mandates, they're quite targeted, they're not general. And then three, finally, you should only be talking about mandates after you've tried more voluntary, more persuasive efforts to try and get people to get the vaccine. And frankly, we are only just beginning as a country to use really sophisticated social science informed techniques to educate, persuade, inform people about the vaccine. And then finally, even if we do start talking about mandates, we should be talking about the most minimally coercive sorts of policies possible. We're not talking about forcibly holding people down and vaccinating them, but giving them incentives or introducing small disincentives is almost always enough to move the needle the way we need to protect public health.
Okay, and I think this will be our last question. Two quick practical questions about the vaccine. Number one, if one has already had COVID, a positive COVID test, should they get the vaccine anyway, or do they not need it? And number two, does the vaccine actually prevent transmission of the disease, or does it only prevent you from getting serious illness from the disease? Who would like to take that question?
I can weigh in. If you've had COVID-19, the guidance is yes, please still get vaccinated. We are still learning about what the antibody response looks like after natural infection, how long it might persist for, and our understanding really is not complete. And of course, while it's rare, we have had instances of people becoming reinfected with COVID-19 here in California. Even somebody who had the infection last year, cleared it, and then became infected with a newer variant, first discovered in California last summer. So that's definitely a concern. Secondly, if you've had the vaccines, we ask that you still wear your mask and still physically distance, as Dr. Perl mentioned, because the clinical trials were designed to help us understand, do these vaccines stop you from becoming severely sick with COVID-19? Resoundingly, there's been success stories. That's why we have these vaccination programs. The studies did not tell us if you become less contagious after vaccination. There was some good early news out of the UK a few days ago that the AstraZeneca University of Oxford vaccine, not peer-reviewed data, but early data, that it looks like it might make us less contagious should we become infected. But certainly we cannot become complacent. If you've had the vaccine, even if you've had both shots, that's fantastic, but there's still a chance that you could become infected, not get sick yourself, but pass the virus on to other people.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Yasmin, Dr. Valles, Dr. Perl, and Dr. Navin for your contributions to our panel discussion. And thanks to the audience for your wonderful questions. Everybody have a good day.